World of Warfare presents The Siege of Leningrad. In the Russian city of St. Petersburg, then called Leningrad, a memorial commemorates the heroic inhabitants of the city during the Second World War, when the Nazis waged an unprecedented siege from September 8th of 1941 to January 27th of 1944. The siege became a mass trial of the human soul. Never before in recorded human history had such a large city of some 2.5 to 3 million lives been subjected to such a debilitating period of starvation that lasted an incredible 872 days, making the Siege of Leningrad high on the list of the Nazis' worst crimes against humanity. The severity of the Nazis' intentionally inflicted war crimes at Leningrad has been cobbled together through interviews with those who survived the ordeal, along with journals and diaries that survived Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin's attempt to bury the truth about what happened to Leningrad citizens during the siege, where journal entries by tormented inhabitants confided their deepest thoughts and most terrible memories that gripped everyone forced to experience its horrors. "You must not think about all the terribleness of war," one survivor said in an interview, "otherwise you'll go gray. You have to protect yourself." As those in Leningrad did, they numbed themselves. No normal human can tolerate so much horror every day if he thinks about it more deeply. When Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22nd of 1941, which witnessed 3.8 million Axis forces cross an 1,800-mile front from Poland and East Prussia into the Soviet Union, most Russians in Leningrad had paid little attention to the ongoing war in Europe under the belief that if Germany had the audacity to invade the motherland, Russia's vast population of men would defeat the Nazis by the sheer mass of its countrymen. Even before the June 27th order came out to mobilize for civil protection, a wave of patriotism had raged throughout the Soviet Union, witnessing hundreds of thousands of volunteers who came forward to defend their country. Men from all over Russia received 2 to 3 days of training before being rushed to the front. Thoroughly unprepared for war, many divisions were sent to the front with severe shortages of rifles, communication equipment, or transportation, resulting in the mass slaughter of Russian men until the Soviet High Commander Stavka could increase the supply of weapons and war material by ramping up the country's vast industrial capacities. As Axis troops surged eastward in 3 massive army groups, each was tasked with driving toward 3 strategic objectives: Leningrad, the Ukraine, and Moscow itself. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was the strongest of the 3, with a mission to destroy the Soviet heartland, while Heinz Guderian's Army Group South was tasked with capturing the rich agricultural and industrial resources of the Ukraine, including the seizure of the Ukrainian capital at Kyiv, before crossing the Dnieper River with the goal of capturing the Crimea. Hermann Hoch's Army Group North, lastly, was tasked with invading the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, before capturing the vital industrial city of Leningrad. Before the Siege of Leningrad, Wehrmacht forces had captured much of Russia at a record pace, seizing all of western Belarus in 13 days, the Baltic states in 9, while occupying most of western Ukraine in 17 short days. As a result, by early July of 1941, the Wehrmacht had captured the first of Russia's strategic defensive lines, some 370 miles into the Soviet Union, bolstering their confidence that they could continue their offensive without the worry of a powerful enemy counterattack, leading Hitler and his German High Command to begin planning for an upcoming autumn parade on Red Square, with German tank units participating in the parade column, thereby wiping Soviet-style Bolshevik communism from the face of the earth. only to be replaced by Hitler's Socialist Nazi Party doctrine. By the time the Germans reached Leningrad at the end of August, just 2 months after Operation Barbarossa began, Axis forces had surrounded 3/4 of the city, prompting Hitler to order the city that bore Lenin's name to be destroyed and all her residents killed, the latter for the sake of feeding Nazi troops instead of keeping Soviet prisoners alive during the frigid winter months. As a result of Hitler's orders, combined with a fear of an appearance of defeatism by local Soviet authorities, no citizens of Leningrad were allowed to exit the city, thereby trapping millions of residents inside the increasingly bombed-out city. In response, Leningrad party chief Andrei Zhdanov raised the alarm by mid-August, proclaiming that our beloved hometown is threatened by the imminent invasion of the fascist German troops. Armed with an iron discipline and Bolshevik determinism, we will confront the enemy bravely and deal him a crushing blow. Despite Zhdanov's bravado, Germany's military superiority proved to be overwhelming against the unprepared Soviets, and by September 8th of 1941, the last remaining land connection between Leningrad and the rest of the country had been completely severed. Even while Hitler's battle for Moscow faced imminent defeat, he refused to ease his stranglehold on Leningrad, insisting that his Wehrmacht forces invade the city until its residents either died or surrendered. In response, Hitler's general staff tried to reason with him that German troop losses would be heavy in what would surely become a show of street fighting, while German tank crews would not be able to maneuver within the city in any meaningful way, instead advocating for a forced surrender once Leningrad residents began to starve. Hitler at last capitulated to his general staff, instead ordering the destruction of the city by the Luftwaffe. As a result, airstrikes and bombardments became a part of everyday life during the first few months of the siege, which witnessed some 272 bombardment attacks on the city by year's end, taking the lives of thousands of innocent men, women, and children. By evening, one doctor wrote in his diary, "My soul had become paralyzed." Lena Kasarina, who was 11 at the time of the bombings, recalled that there were air raids every night, always at the same time. At around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, the sirens sounded. We children were woken up, had to get dressed, and were taken to the bomb shelter. It was terrible. Bombs are terrible. If a bomb comes flying, you hear it. It whines. You think it's going to hit you, even though it's actually relatively far away. The whistling death, as the people of Leningrad called it, killed 16,747 civilians, while wounding 33,000 more, leading another diarist to write, "Sometimes you go to work wondering if the building will still be there. Then you go home, wondering if the house is still standing." Describing the post-bombing rubble of the city, writer Lydia Ginsburg wrote, "The torn-up buildings expose their system of stories. Bewildered, the person begins to realize that he's floating in the air when sitting in his room at home, and that other people are hovering too, above his head and beneath his feet." The danger from the skies was soon joined by a second threat when reserves of food began to dwindle after the first few weeks of the siege. Ration cards were issued immediately, yet as flour for bread became increasingly scarce, ration amounts were reduced at least 5 times until 125 grams of bread was issued per person per day for children and non-working adults, while manual laborers received 250 grams per day by November 25th, made not from flour, but from a mixture of malt and bran, which most survivors recalled as truly disgusting, comprising bread as black as clay and as dry as dirt. Residents also received a ridiculously small amount of meat and fat each day, amounting to 460 daily calories for non-workers, which was less than a quarter of the daily caloric intake needed to sustain even a non-active adult female. as people began to die from starvation. Survivors have reported that their behaviors changed surprisingly fast, as residents began to grapple with the moral dilemma of whether to help a recently fallen person or keep walking to work, thereby ensuring that their own family's daily ration could be earned. As starvation worsened in December, however, most residents had abandoned the last of their guilt. Corpses on the street became a daily sight as the death toll rose from week to week, leading to some 300,000 deaths in Leningrad from January to the end of March 1942. I remember seeing bodies on sleds just wrapped in sheets, one diarist recalled, pulled by people who could barely stand on their feet. Water scarcity became yet another short commodity in the particularly harsh winter of 1941 and 42, where daytime temperatures hovered at minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, forcing the population to hunt desperately for the liquid necessity, including women who hauled tediously filled buckets back to their apartment buildings. Never before or since had meteorologists recorded such prolonged cold temperatures, forcing people to sleep in as many layers of clothes as they could manage to put on. At night, their hair froze to blankets, while going to the bathroom was a near impossibility, especially in 4, 5, and 6-story walk-ups, where lack of water and prolonged starvation made residents too weak to make the climb. People were constantly on the lookout for food, one survivor recalled. Once when I was out, I saw a Red Army soldier transporting a box of ammunition by cart. The horse could barely move. He cracked the whip, yelled at the horse, and then it fell down. People appeared from everywhere and began cutting pieces of meat from it. The soldier had a gun and shot it into the air, and I said, "Why are you shooting? That won't bring him back to his feet." So the horse was butchered alive. The same fate happened to the last remaining animals at the Leningrad Zoo, as did beloved pets at home, which eventually wound up in the family stove. Cats and dogs were considered a delicacy, leading one diarist to write on December 2nd of 1941 that "we found and killed a cat," followed by a diary entry the following day that glibly stated, "We ate fried cat, very tasty." The brutalization didn't stop there, when some residents resorted to cannibalism, an event that was swept under the rug for decades by Communist Party censors who wanted to bury the truth as deep as possible. Not until after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 did the truth resurface, exposing reports about desperate people actively hunting for dead bodies to eat, even trading human flesh commercially and selling it as chopped meat. Other records revealed 2,105 arrests for cannibalism up until the end of 1942, when the gory phenomenon at last petered out. The vast majority of cannibalistic participants did not murder for food, but rather scavenged the dead from streets and cemeteries, generally by desperate peasant-class villagers who had moved to Leningrad before the siege in search of work. In the Second Siege Museum of Leningrad, recipes are on display of just how desperate starving residents had become, chronicling how to prepare goose feet or bran patties fried in engine oil. People attempted to make food from anything that they could get their hands on, including a huge number of recipes for making cheese, cottage cheese, and curd from products other than dairy, while others described how to make aspic from carpenter's glue boiled with bay leaves and pepper. Anything made of leather was boiled for long periods of time, often for days on end. Others fed their starving children by slicing their own veins to offer their own blood as sustenance for survival. Although Hitler expected the residents of Leningrad to surrender by September or October of 1941, proud Leningradians simply refused to raise a white flag, making Leningrad the only besieged city in Europe that did not capitulate during World War II. According to Soviet propaganda at the time, Leningrad factories were still producing necessary war material for the defense of Moscow, and while historians have pointed to the possible salvation of hundreds of thousands of Leningrad civilians if war resources had been diverted for the liberation of Leningrad. In truth, the Red Army suffered debilitating losses in the early weeks of Germany's encirclement of the city, where volunteer units served as cannon fodder to protect the city from falling. Some salvation finally arrived after Lake Ladoga, northeast of Leningrad, finally froze in late November of 1941, allowing vehicles to supply the city with much-needed food stocks. Eventually, 6 parallel routes crossed the lake in a lengthy, cumbersome, and dangerous passage into Leningrad, and while many vehicles fell through the ice, some 270,000 tons of food and 90,000 tons of fuel eventually reached the starving residents of the bitterly cold city. Even so, food supplies still fell far short of demand, leading to the deaths of 192,000 Leningrad civilians in the first 2 months of 1942 alone, a rising death toll that finally convinced city officials to call for a major evacuation of the beleaguered city. Eventually known as the Road of Life, the nearly 100-mile journey over the icy dangers of Lake Ladoga at last delivered starving Leningrad residents into safer villages, where at least supplies were guaranteed. Many of the evacuees were orphan children whose parents had starved before their eyes, leaving them destitute, malnourished, and in need of medical care. If it was 38 below in Leningrad, the trip over the desert of ice was even colder, as evacuees sat huddled in the backs of transport trucks. To make matters even more deadly, the Luftwaffe did their best to destroy evacuation convoys, bombing and strafing caravans that sent many trucks and their human cargoes to the bottom of the lake. Despite the Nazis' criminal attacks, by springtime, when melting ice began to limit the use of the lake, some 1 million people had been evacuated via the Lake Ladoga lifeline. Once the lake became impassable, boats and ships took over the task of evacuating residents, although their capacity was much lower and the crossings much longer than the winter of 1942. When the Siege of Leningrad ended on January 27th of 1944, after the Soviet Red Army had at last defeated the Germans due to their seemingly inexhaustible reserves of manpower and industrial might, the Siege of Leningrad had taken the lives of 642,000 civilians, while the evacuations alone had killed an additional 400,000 innocent lives, making the Siege of Leningrad one of the worst German atrocities of the Second World War.